Welcome to the Africa Urban Lab podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Lockhart. Today, I speak with Astrid Haas, an Austrian-Ugandan urban economist and one of the top experts working on municipal finance with African cities across the continent today. Astrid has a ton of different appointments, but in my biased opinion, very biased opinion, the most important appointment is as one of our lecturers here at the Africa Urban Lab. Today, we talk with Astrid about financing African cities. I hope you enjoy. Astrid Haas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. Always a pleasure to speak to you.
Great. So first, before diving in, you're an urban finance aficionado, especially when it comes to African cities. But before getting all in the weeds with urban finance stuff, I just wanted a few background questions for you. And the first one involves, you've done a lot of work both today and in the past around sort of translating research into policy action. And this is something near and dear to the Africa Urban Lab's heart, this bridge between research and policy change. So I wanted to start on this, is, your experience as that bridge. What were your sort of top 2 or 3 lessons that you learned, the best way to get evidence-informed research actually translated into policy change in the real world? And examples are great. Examples are welcome.
So you know what? Interestingly, you sent me this question before and it gave me a little bit of pause for thought because I've never really sort of stepped back and sort of thought, okay, what are the 2 to 3 things that I would say? And then, thinking about it more, I actually drew on some lessons that came up to me during the time we were working on the COVID-19 pandemic, and we were trying to get research and evidence-based policy in a world that was rapidly changing in really imperfect information. And that's the time where really, together with, Adnan Khan and Asim Khwaja, like we sat down, we really thought, how does this work? And I think a lot of the lessons we learned from there, I think are very applicable to times now as well, and working on urbanization. So I'd say I'd put it down to 3 things. And the first thing is, and this might sound a little obvious, but is really that when we talk about translating research to policy, let's focus on the decisions that actually require evidence and require research. I think all too often we spend a lot of resources doing research on things that really could be a decision that should just be taken. I think one of my favorite professors in this respect, Ken Opalo at Georgetown, he often has a tweet that goes, just feed the kids, right? Like there's so much research.
Yeah.
We feed kids more, how does that impact test scores? Like that's not a question. We should be feeding school kids, right? So I think, similarly, there are just some decisions that policymakers need to take that unequivocally they need to take, irrespective of what the evidence, whether we have more evidence on it or not.
Right. Yeah.
And then I think they're on the other side of the spectrum. I think there are decisions that do definitely require more research and more evidence. And particularly when we think about the African cities context, I think those are the ones where there are high costs and not very clear benefits yet, right? Because we are working in a very resource constrained environment. This is a conversation obviously around urban finance. And so, we work with opportunity costs, right? And I think here is probably the place where, Curtis, you and I differ the most. But it's really like, for me, one of the clearest examples there is like, whether we should be building fully new cities to meet Africa's needs. To me, that's an extremely risky bet with very, very little evidence base for the benefits. And I think, where we do have a lot of evidence is like if we can invest, and I think this is something the African Urban Lab also does really well, through, obviously with Dr. Patrick Lamson Hall, is like how you invest in places where people are actually moving, right? Where you can actually use the research and you can understand. We're not determining making people move, but we're actually focusing on where they have moved and investing there. So I think, those are the types of decisions. And I think in between those 2 ends of the spectrum, I think for every decision, or as a policymaker, for every decision one makes, one should use all the information that is available to you at that time of making the decision. And there is often more information available than we sometimes think. As researchers, we think, especially as economists, we think about big data sets and everything else. But actually, information comes in a lot of ways, shapes, and forms. And so how do we package that and how do we use that? I think that's, key to helping understand key to being able to unlock that for policymakers to make decisions. And then once they've made the decision, collecting the data to understand the impact of that decision and sort of iterating accordingly. And then again, going back, not every decision requires research, but not every policy making piece is also, or not every piece of research is really relevant for policy making. That's fine. Some research is just really about evolving the policy frontier. But I think there's an ethical responsibility for researchers who are working with policymakers in constrained environments, so both resource and time constrained, to also help, like if you're just using their data or using their time, also give back to them, right? So you may just do, I don't know, help them analyze, do some data analysis on some Excel, which has nothing to do particularly with your research, but also values that time and resource constraint they're working in and helps them actually make better decisions as well. So that's how I've sort of compartmentalized the sort of research to evidence piece.
Great, and I guess somewhat similar to your straddling the research policy divide. You also straddle a couple worlds. You're Ugandan, Austrian, so you have backgrounds both in Africa and the continent and in Europe. Now you've been living in Hong Kong for about a year and a half. So I wanted to ask you about this, right? And it's always been a dream of mine to do a similar type of thing. Living in Hong Kong, traveling around Asia in the last year and a half. What have you learned from Asian cities that now informs your views about what's possible in African cities?
Yeah, so I made a very crazy decision about 1.5 years ago to move halfway across the world, as you said, to
Which
live
I'm
in.
jealous of, by the way. I do want to do it at some point.
And here, shout out to the Hong Kong government's top talent scheme, which allows you to do this, right? I'm here on a currently 2-year visa to be able to live here and explore the opportunities that Hong Kong has to offer. And I think it's a great visa scheme in that sense, right? Because it's not necessarily tied to anything. And so I saw that as an opportunity to try and learn. I wanted to understand and learn from the place, both that has urbanized most recently and most rapidly, vis-a-vis African urbanization. So that's the Asian continent, but also more specifically with Hong Kong and mainland China, like somewhere that is also shaping Africa's urbanization processes through the investments that are being made, from mainland China with finance flowing through Hong Kong, that are really sort of directly shaping the cities on our continent. I wanted to understand that more. And that's partially why I moved to this part of the world. And it has, Hong Kong is also an incredible sort of node and gateway to the rest of Asia. So I've had the opportunity to both travel and work in different Asian contexts. And I think one of the biggest lessons I take away from this, which again may not be super groundbreaking, but let me unpack it a little bit more for you. But there isn't a single best practice, and there's not one size fits all model. So even when we talk about the East Asian tigers, right, each of them actually has a very, very different urbanization pathway that didn't happen overnight, first of all. And that is also very deeply shaped by the historical, sort of economic, institutional, and cultural institutions that are in those specific places. In fact, even the cities in different countries. Now, Hong Kong's a bit different because Hong Kong is a city state, but even cities in China all have very different urbanization pathways, right? So one way to try and describe this is like something I've always been fascinated about is Hong Kong's ability to leverage its land values to invest in public infrastructure and services. As you know, my thing is about how we can better invest in public infrastructure and services, and Hong Kong is a model that has done this, sort of leveraging land values. And a question I always asked myself was like, well, Hong Kong was a British colony and the country I come from, Uganda, was a British colony, but we've taken two very different urbanization pathways. Why is that the case? And one of the things that I really come to learn about sort of Hong Kong's land value capture journey, right, is that when the British annexed Hong Kong in 1841, it was for a very different reason than for the reason that, the UK colonized Uganda. And here it was, they came and they found a very sparsely populated island. I think estimates had like a population of something like 7,500 plus or minus people living. Not very many indigenous institutional structures, particularly around land. And they saw this as a port, trading port. So they
Right.
really wanted to invest in institutions that would allow them to essentially exploit the trade. Whereas in Uganda, it was about institutions that would extract and essentially exploit that. And those two very different institutions have led, and obviously in Uganda they found much bigger populations, lots of different tribes and kingdoms with very many indigenous and customary land structures, which they in many places overlaid. But that has had an impact on how we can then, for example, undertake land-based financing in cities in the future.
Yep.
And so I think for us to understand is how we understand the context that we're in and how they were shaped. And I think what the Asian models, if we want to call them that, have shown us is how you leverage that institutional history, build on it, build those context specific practices, and then be able to be able to really grow in a very globalized economy, but still in a very localized manner.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. I mean, as you were comparing, um, the way Ugandan urbanization is unfolding versus Hong Kong urbanization, despite being both kind of at a time British colonies. I started thinking about like Melissa Dell's work, for example. She's done
Yeah.
this work on the Maida in Peru, as well as the Dutch colonial possessions in Java, and in Peru, the extractive system they set up around these silver mines had super detrimental effects. Hundreds of years, generations later. Whereas in Java, it was the opposite. And it's because of what they were there for. In Peru, it was for silver mining, which is fundamentally sort of extractive. You just get the silver, you ship it out. In Java, it was sugar, and before, like, they had to invest in this processing infrastructure, the Dutch, because sugar wasn't great raw to transport internationally. And so they invested locally in a bunch of roads and trading networks and processing facilities and stuff that generations later had all these positive benefits that was totally the opposite of what happened in Peru. So that point of like, guess what? Even though it's similar folks, depending on what you're there for, you can set up different types of institutions, and those can have long-term impacts. No, this is great. So you chatted a bit about kind of East Asian tigers and China, Hong Kong. You already mentioned new cities, and kind of I'm somewhat interested in that space, and I know Shenzhen is a neighbor. If you've had the chance to visit, which I'm sure you had because you know Joanne Du, and I'm a fan, and I think you're a fan of hers. Um, you and I have chatted a few times about new cities. What are your thoughts on Shenzhen from that angle?
I mean, I think this is the exact. I think the Shenzhen story is so nicely and easily packageable as a case study, and it's used a lot. So I was very fascinated to understand more. I think it was one of the areas. I think Shenzhen is the exact example of where it's a lot messier and a lot more ingrained in historical and structures than I think we make it out to be when we sort of package that story. I don't even think it's been properly replicated in any way in China to the same success. I think there's a lot that Shenzhen benefits from being part of the Greater Bay Area, which is now the sort of Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Shenzhen area. But there's also a lot of historical structures that, I think they always say from fishing village to instant city and in a couple of decades. But I think those fishing villages, and I think Joan Doe and her book, The Shenzhen Experiment, which is an awesome read, which I really recommend for everyone to try and understand that it really isn't an instant city, but carries a lot of historical weight. She highlights that, and I think that Shenzhen is an excellent example of that. Shenzhen is also an excellent example of how rapid density can be managed, or how rapidly growing density can and needs to be managed to be able to create economic growth. One of
Mm,
the reason we have the Greater Bay Area right now is because Shenzhen is directly competing with Hong Kong. I mean, we can go there now with a metro
right.
ride, right? And so you really you when you become successful, you can do that relatively quickly. I think that's a good lesson, but you can't do that with a sort of copy paste methodology. It's really about
Mm,
exploiting the context that you have to work with and being able to build on that. In the case of Shenzhen, there was a historical context. There was also the sort of the policy and the experimental context that was, during the reforms. And then it's also, it's a great location, geographically very well located city.
Yeah. Yeah. No, on the, I guess you could call it jurisdictional competition from the fact Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, you could even lump Singapore, though it's further, um, are all somewhat geographically proximate, and it sets up this sort of competitive or disciplining dynamic. It's like, to me, that's sort of, they do have much more of a system of cities built out in sort of East Asia, Southeast Asia, than is prevalent in a lot of countries here in Africa, where it's typically dominated by primacy and primate cities. So that's something, like, in particular, I'm really interested in this question of how does the way the system of cities is set up impact urban outcomes. Um, Okay, but so moving on, those were sort of the background questions I wanted to get at. Now, just switching gears a bit and looking at more urban finance specific issues. I wanted to start first at a high level, and then we can sort of start to zoom in at more nitty gritty urban finance issues. So first, just very very macroscopically, Astrid, tell us why urban finance in African cities is both very very important as well as incredibly challenging. Go for it.
Yeah. So this is my soapbox elevator speech that I've been giving over many years, but I think now finally is gaining traction across the globe. I think the fundamental part is that urbanization is an unstoppable force in Africa. Right? By between now and 2050, we're going to add nearly a billion more people to our cities. Our cities are going to grow. Full stop, right? There's no changing that. That's going to happen. I think, interestingly enough, of those 1 billion more people, about 830 million are estimated to be youth, so young people, right? That, interestingly, is 1 in 3 people, young people globally by 2050 are going to be Africans, and I think that's a great opportunity, right? If you think about the potential of the labor force, if you think about the potential of ideas that could come out of the young population. But as we also know, just getting a lot of people into a small space, which is what cities are essentially, right? Without any sort of investments in how to manage that space, comes with a lot of downsides, right? It comes with increased informal settlements, congestion, crime, or, as the recent pandemic showed us, also waves of health issues. And so, what the money part of this is how we are able to make those investments to manage that density, to manage people being able to settle closely with one another and be able to leverage the upsides whilst minimizing the downsides of this density. And I think very critically for Africa's perspective is also how to do this in a climate constrained environment, right? Because up until now, everywhere we've done it, including where I'm living right now, right, it's been done with a sort of very fossil fuel heavy type transition. We cannot do
Mhm.
this anymore. Africa has to delink its growth from high carbon emissions, right? And so we're looking to do this in a unique way anyway, for the benefit of the globe. Um, so that's the opportunity, right? But quite frankly, I don't feel like this opportunity or the urgency, maybe, as I said, maybe now it's being heard, but whether it's being
Mhm.
acted upon is a different issue. And I think if you just look at some of the numbers, right? Currently, Africa spends only about 3% of its GDP on urban development. That's minuscule, especially if you think in terms of absolute numbers. We have one of the lowest tax to GDP as a continent, one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world globally, right?
Mhm.
And then if you think about what money is coming in, it's only about 5.2% of global foreign direct investment is coming in this side. So there's the macro figures, and then I think if we look beyond the macro figures to like the real everyday realities of the cities, is that urban finance is just not structurally suited to in many African cities to attract money and to be able to make that money like linked to the investments that are needed.
Mhm.
Um, so I think we really need to now, I think it's been heard that, urbanization is there. Urbanization has a massive potential to transform Africa and also the world. So African cities really matter to the world, and what happens there will matter to the world. But we really need to now get the finance to manage that density, and we need to get it now because whatever we do now in the next 10 years essentially is going to lock in the urbanization trajectory for the future.
Yeah. And then, I mean, soapbox well done. That's like the last point you hit on, um, is also the one that sort of haunts me and motivates me. It's just like there's this path dependence to urbanization, right? The choices we make now in how to build these cities, and they will be built. It's just a matter of how they'll be built, and those decisions will have ramifications, and almost in some way they won't be locked in, but they'll be sticky for generations and generations to come. So that it adds extra urgency to an already urgent situation. Um, so you recently wrote, I should say co-wrote a report. I have it here. I'm going to show it and try and make you somewhat embarrassed. Here's the report from the African Development Bank. It's Astrid, along with several co-authors, called "From Millions to Billions: Financing the Development of African Cities." Again, highly recommended if you are an African cities nerd or an urban finance nerd. It's phenomenal. Um, and we're going to delve into it. So basically, the report looks at both demand constraints for cities that are looking for financing, and it looks at supply constraints. So any bottlenecks getting in the way of creditors lending cities financing. So I wanted to start on. I'll start on the demand side, and then they'll sort of move over to the supply side. On the demand side constraints, it goes over things like national transfers, so intergovernmental transfers from the center to the municipalities. It goes over things like borrowing, and both borrowing domestically as well as internationally. It goes over constraints around raising own source revenue, poor absorption capacity, and then maybe for some of the folks who aren't in the weeds in urban finance every day, it also goes over this relatively more obscure thing of having basically weak or non-existent urban infrastructure projects in a pipeline, and sort of ready and investable to direct the funds that you raise towards. And so I want to get into each of these because they're all highlighted in this recent report. So just starting with transfers from the national level, what do you see as in this area the biggest challenges? If there are if there are countries that have been bright spots in this area of intergovernmental transfers from the nation to the locality, which are those, and sort of what reforms have they undertaken to become bright spots in this area?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think, intergovernmental fiscal transfers, which you say are just, transfers from a higher level of government to a lower level of government, are a key source of city financing everywhere in the world, right? That's just how a lot of cities get their money because, national governments generally have more money, and so they distribute it to local governments, but also because that's where money is being raised and transferred back to the national government. So it's a distribution mechanism essentially, right? I think the difference in the African context is that intergovernmental fiscal transfers make just a much, much larger share of cities' budgets, right? So it is the overwhelming proportion. Particularly when you get down to smaller cities, it can be 90 to 100% of their budget can be just coming from national governments, right? And the challenge with this, first of all, is that it limits autonomy on a city level because you're this beholden to someone else's purse string, so to speak. But I think the from a technical standpoint, it is also problematic because currently the way that transfers are constructed, they're not always predictable, both in terms of when the city will receive the transfer and how much the city will receive in the transfer. And this generally seems to be a problem across many African cities. And also the fact that it makes such a large part of their budget, they don't have the ability yet to kind of leverage those transfers to be able to borrow more money. And so, I think what we look at in this report is really the ability to, first of all, stabilize the transfers so that their predictability becomes key. And here, the bright spots are those countries that have developed independent fiscal commissions. So these are politically independent fiscal commissions who really determine how transfers should be made. You have
I
a
think
question?
you wrote about Mexico, right? Had these
Yeah,
kind of independent.
I'll come to Mexico afterwards, but I think first of all, let's stick to the continent first, which is, how do we improve the predictability of the transfer? So how do we make the time and the timing and the amount? And so these independent fiscal commissions, for example, Kenya has one, South Africa has one. We talk about Algeria's, right? They essentially determine a the formula by which different local governments were going to be getting their money, and they can also work with the national treasury in the respective countries to ensure that the money gets transferred on time. And this helps cities then, like a large part of the city's budget, become much more predictable, and so they know when the money is coming in. The second part is, once you know when the money is coming in, how you can leverage that money to be able to raise more money, right? And so in this case, we used, as you said, Mexico as the example, because Mexican states and cities went through similar challenges where with a lot of unpredictability. And so, in addition to the reforms mentioned already about creating fiscal commissions and being able to improve the predictability, another thing that Mexico did was to figure out a way that they could leverage the transfers to borrow more money. And
Right.
part of what that meant was that they had to ring fence or find a mechanism, legal mechanism, to ring fence part of the transfer, so that if a state borrowed, for example, or a city borrowed, that when the transfer was made to the city or the state, that first tranche of the transfer was used to repay debtors. This created a lot of this helped create confidence for investors because they knew they were going to be repaid. Also, because now the stream of revenue became more predictable. And it created more liquidity for the subnational governments because now they could borrow against this important source of their own budget. And actually, now since we've written the report, I've actually discovered that certain states in Nigeria are doing this, starting to do this as well, right? So certain mechanisms are also being developed in Nigeria that are very similar, where you create these financial innovations where you take the transfer as the element you can borrow against in your budget. So I think it's really this transparent, predictable, rule based part is the first piece, and then the second piece is how you create the mechanisms to then be able to, for cities to be able to borrow against that, particularly where it is such an important source of their own budgets.
Hmm. Yeah, so this is fascinating, and I was gonna later on in the podcast ask about sort of what's happened since you guys published the report. So maybe I'll ask about the Nigerian states and what they've been up to then. But first, so we just covered transfers. Let's go over some of the other demand constraints that the report goes over. So, sort of, I want to ask a similar question for both borrowing through capital markets as well as raising own source revenue. What are sort of the top 2 to 3 challenges for each of those? And are there some successful cases that have overcome these challenges with both first borrowing and second raising own source revenue?
I think let's move borrowing to the side at the moment, because I think borrowing is a much more complex situation. I think there's a lot of constraints when it comes to borrowing in the African continent. I think on the own source revenue side, I think the diagnosis is slightly easier. Although again, I usually caveat this at the beginning, and there is a caveat in the report itself. Africa is a very diverse continent. We're talking here about like 54 countries and even more heterogeneous cities. So everything I'm saying now obviously has nuance in the respective country and city that we're talking about. But I think there is again a general trend that one of the challenges with raising own source revenue, so this is money so the cities can raise themselves and spend themselves, is around the fact that a lot of African contexts are very centralized, right? So a lot of
Mm.
decisions that are being made are still at a national level. A lot of the ability to raise revenue are still at a national level. And so cities have limited political authority to raise the revenue. But even where they do have the policy authority to do that, like there are also administrative constraints, right? So partly this may be um, very, sort of simple parts where, revenue collection is just still being done manually, which means, sending someone out to be able to collect the money, which can only reach so many people at any one period of time. It can also cause leakages in systems. It can be just very outdated information about who should be paying what, when, and why. So just not
Right.
having histories there. And from a from a capacity standpoint within the city, it can just mean not having enough people assigned to the question of revenue, right? So there from I think I always, when I work with cities, I think the administrative pieces are easier both to diagnose and probably and I don't say this flippantly, easier to resolve, because I know it's difficult to resolve, but the more technically able to resolve, and something that a city has in their own power to resolve. When it comes to the policy levers, this becomes a little bit more complex, because this involves maybe legislation and parliamentarians and councils, etc. Becomes more difficult to change. But I think there's a lot of change that can be done at own source revenue level from an administrative perspective.
Mhm. And yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned it when you were talking about Hong Kong and how they've been able to invest in public infrastructure. In particular, I know Hong Kong has a really great public transit network, and they were able to do that by, as you alluded to, setting up land value capture mechanisms in place before folks moved in. And so, land value capture, whether it be in the form of property taxation or some other sort of land rate, um, is to me a really promising mechanism in this broader realm of like own source revenue mobilization across African cities, and something that the Africa Urban Lab is increasingly looking into as an area we can get involved in. So exciting stuff. Just moving on the absorption capacity issue that you and co-authors wrote about in the report. This is where I gotta be frank here. This is where, for me, things got a little crazy, because despite a lack of own source revenue raise that you just talked about, despite a lack of access to capital markets from which to borrow, despite lower, unreliable, sometimes unpredictable national transfers, which you already talked about, despite all of this, local governments, they're still somehow failing to spend all of the very limited money that they're actually able to raise. And so one of the case studies, and the report is great, just for that sense. There's this annex with a bunch of case studies from across the continent, but just use one as an example. Kisumu in Kenya had an absorption rate, I think it was 31 or 32%, only 31 or 32% of their budget that they had for a fiscal year were they actually able to spend, which is just like, that's less than a third. That's crazy. So can you just for unpack what is going on here? Because I think this one in particular would probably baffle most people. Cities have this money for a given fiscal year. What are the actual things getting in the way of these cities being able to mobilize that money that they currently have and actually spending it, especially given it's already so small, and the fact that we then divide that small pot by a third is really bad. So what's getting in the way here?
Yeah. So first of all, just to say, it's the capital budget, right? So I think where the absorption capacity. So these are like investments in infrastructure, which are the ones that we're talking about here. I think that one of the things that I'm going to, again, just say from the outset in responding to this question, is that I do approach this question with a lot of humility, that I only work sort of as an advisor to cities, and I don't actually have to do the implementing myself. And so I think there's a lot that I don't understand, that is very deeply complex in the way cities operate, in the sort of bureaucratic and administrative processes and logistical constraints that are not maybe automatically immediately visible. And then obviously the political economy around that, right? So I think, it's always easier to criticize from the outside than actually have to do yourself.
Totally,
That being
yeah.
said,
I do
the
not
thing that
envy these municipal tax officials, by the way.
and but I think there were probably, my observations would probably point to three things, right? First of all, is what we've just talked about, which is the unpredictability of the money coming in. If you do have unpredictable transfers, you don't actually know when you're going to get the money, and so therefore you don't actually know when you need to spend the money. But then there's a budget year, and if you don't spend it by a certain time, then it's just going to be clawed back, right? And I think if you
Right.
that's really difficult in planning, right? Like anyone who doesn't know, like, just think about your personal finances, right? Say that you needed to buy a car between now and June, but you don't know between now and June when you're going to have that, but you still have to make a decision on like which car and how fast, and this, that, the other, and then suddenly the opportunity is gone, right? Because the money is just taken back again. I think that's the unpredictability really impacts that.
Mm,
The second one is probably the one of the least sexy topics when it comes to urban finance, which is procurement processes, right? And I hop on about these a lot because I don't think they're given enough credit because it's not, unfortunately, something that's very flashy to put on the front of a you know a nice pamphlet or something. But procurement processes in many of these cities are so outdated and so inefficient that even when the money comes in, it's just really difficult to get the money out again because you have to go through so many often manual processes that involve signatures and stamps by multiple different layers and people. And I think so a lot of reform can be done on procurement processes that I think would improve absorption capacity immensely. And then I think a third thing, which we'll probably come to as well in more detail in this conversation, is just um, these cities are faced with so many really pressing needs, right? And
mm,
very, very little money. So, yes, we're talking about the budget they already have, but that's really tiny. The question is like, how do you make a decision about where to even put that tiny piece of money that you have already? And how do you make that decision? There's always going to be people who are going to be upset about how you made that decision. And how do you then placate those people, right? And I think those decision making processes on how to prioritize are also ones that probably slow the ability to implement, right? So I think these are all things that play. I'm not saying that any one of these things is the immediate answer, but I think they're all things that play into why it's actually difficult to spend money. And I think we have a lot of capacity, technical advisory capacity going in how to raise money, and probably a lot less into thinking about the spending of money. And I think, it's just something that I generally, talk to development partners to think about is like, we also have to think about the spending side, not just the raising side, right? Like it's equally important and it's equally part of the social contract.
yeah, and I think that's a great segue into the last on the list in terms of the demand constraints that you guys wrote about, and that's the lack of a tangible list of projects that these cities would be directing their raised money towards, right? And I think the report put it really well. You guys wrote very few cities in Africa have a clear sense of, number one, how much they need to borrow, number two, why they need to borrow it, and number three, for which projects it would be most preferable to borrow. And so just for you, when all is said and done, what are the key blockages here getting in the way of coming up with this sensible pipeline of implementable, um, what's the word that they use, bankable projects?
Yeah. So I think, visioning something is relatively easy and costless. I mean, again, not saying that flippantly, because I do think you have to take into account multiple competing needs. I also don't think, we've, in many cities I work in have quite got the sort of stakeholder and participatory mechanism down to a good art where we can input into these visions. But let's say, you have your vision. I think actually what's a little more technically complex and also costly is translating that vision into something that is actually something that is financeable.
Mm,
And so you'll find a lot of cities that have strategic plans and strategic visions and, maybe 5 years, 10 years, right? But what does that mean to someone who wants to come and put the money into the city? And I think that's a big question. And I think first thing is that we underestimate the cost, like actually financial cost of doing that. And the financial cost is called project preparation. It involves creating feasibility studies, technical studies, legal studies, financing cost estimates, etc., to be able to understand what it means to be able to bring that project to fruition, essentially, right? And there is estimates that I've seen that say that it's about 10% of the project's value that necessarily have to go into project preparation costs. And there
right.
are a lot of project preparation funds out there now, and they all do great work, but they tend to focus on, let's say, one, maybe two projects a city, and that's not necessarily a pipeline. Like an investor who goes into a city and takes time to understand a city wants to invest in more than one project in a city, right? And so if there's no pipeline, they'll be like, okay, well, there's no point to me trying to understand the nuances
Right.
of the city. I have nothing to
And
invest in.
I remember on this point, I think you correct me if this is wrong, but I think the average project size to not just the number of projects, but in Kisumu, the average project size was something like $88,000 a project or something. That's also not something that an investor, after coming in and doing all this due diligence to invest 88,000 bucks, is yeah, not a long term viable thing.
No, exactly. And that, I mean, that's my second point, right? Is that there's a mismatch between how much money investors want to put in because they want to cover their administrative due diligence costs of like getting to know a place, particularly if they're investors from somewhere else, right? It takes time, it takes money. You invest, you want to understand the place, you want to understand your. You're not going to do that if that's not even covered by the money that you can sort of feasibly put into a project. Yet for many cities, particularly secondary cities, particularly the ones that are like some of the fastest growing, they do need these small investments, right? And so there's
Mm,
a mismatch between like what their projects require versus what the money wants to invest in. And then the
mm,
final thing I would say is the time horizons, right? I think we're developing a strong project pipeline, and I think we'll talk a little bit about Cape Town as well. But it requires like long term financial planning and long term visioning, um, because someone who wants to put their money into infrastructure wants a commitment that it will be repaid over time, and time being the operative word over there, right? And I think African cities still operate in very short term political environments. I mean, any city does, right? But I think the difference with many African cities is that the institutional structures are not yet mature enough to insulate the projects from the
right.
that turnover, right? And that creates uncertainty that sort of deters investment. And so if you don't have a very clear, credible signal that your project pipeline is there and is not going to change every 5 years, then an investor is going to be like, well, am I going to put money in that I require repaying 10, 12 or 20 years? Probably not, right? So it's it's
Right.
it's difficult.
Yeah. Um, so this is great, and this may, for listeners, it may start to be sounding like this long laundry list of doom or something like that. That's not my intention. So I wanted to pause for a bit and let Astrid talk about some relative success stories amongst African cities when it comes to urban finance. So just me going through the report and especially the case studies in the annex. Um, a couple stuck out, but in particular, Cape Town stuck out as a city that has seemingly invested a lot in kind of forward-looking planning and done relatively well on most of the things that Astrid's been talking about: transfers, borrowing, raising own source revenue, kind of having a defined pipeline of projects, and then on the absorption capacity fund, actually channeling the revenues raised towards these projects. So, Astrid, do you want to talk a little bit about this success case, the sort of big two or three items other cities can learn from this success? And if you want to talk about others other than Cape Town, that's also fine too. That was the one that stuck out to me.
No, absolutely. It's funny because I recently, or it just came out off a call before where someone was saying, "Oh yes, Cape Town," but other African cities they always get a little annoyed about hearing about Cape Town all the time because I think the one thing I would say about Cape Town or South African cities in general is that they do have a very unique institutional
Right.
structure, which is that in the South African Constitution creates three separate but, and importantly, equal spheres of government, which means that cities and municipalities and local governments in South Africa have really important independent powers that most, if not all, other African cities do not, right?
Hmm.
And so a strong African city, a strong South African city really can be a strong South African city because it doesn't have to rely on another sphere of government to be able to make the relevant decisions. So I think in that context, that South African cities, but even within the South African cities, Cape Town stands out. And so I think it is important to see, what can be learned from it. Um, and I think, again, Cape Town may stand out because it also has had relative political stability. I mean, it's been ruled by the same governing party for
Yeah.
over I think since the Constitution was since the post-apartheid era. Um,
Back to your long time horizons thing actually being somewhat useful if what you're trying to do is attract investment, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And interestingly, from an own source revenue perspective, another thing that's very unique about South African cities that not many other cities on the continent, at least not any others that I know of, they manage their own utilities. And so that's a
Mm,
really important part. So, for example, when you default, for example, on your property tax, the city actually has the power to say, well, we can take it off your electricity bill, right? Which not many other
okay.
have the ability to do so. That helps on own source revenue. All of those unique factors aside, I do still think there is important lessons to be learned from Cape Town for other African cities, and that are transferable sort of lessons in that sense. And I use transferable lessons as opposed to best practice because I don't think these are best practice. I just think these are things that can be learned from. So one is how Cape Town has established its borrowing strategy. It creates its strategy and then it invites financiers to buy into that strategy. Now, that
Mm,
sounds logical and what everyone should do. But in fact, I see it in most cities I work in the other way around, which is like a financier will come and say, actually, this is what I want to finance. And the city will go, yes, 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 because they're so desperate for money. And I think the ability to actually have your visioning and your strategy and say to them to financiers, take it or leave it is really important. Another city that does this really well is Kigali, right? Where it
yeah.
creates its own vision and its own strategy. And then financiers can come and they can say, actually, we'll take that part. But if it's without it, then the city will say no. So the ability to say no because
Yeah.
it doesn't fit into your strategy, that creates
Yeah.
that credibility.
I was going to say, so this has come up. I'm glad you brought this up because this point is, I think, important. People, when they talk about visions, it sounds fuzzy and stuff, but I think it's actually very, very important. It came up in, for example, a podcast I did with Stefan Durkon in his relatively recent book, Gambling on Development. He contrasted at the very beginning meetings with the Ethiopian government. I think it was under Meles, and then he went straight from there to DRC. And the Ethiopian government came with their own vision and their own strategy, right? Whereas the DRC guys are just kind of whatever you guys say, like we're on board, like let's go. And I think recently, you mentioned Ken Opalo earlier. He put out a great essay on his Substack after the USAID and other
Yeah.
aid cuts have been happening about. He used a great term. It was "quote unquote" outsourcing aspiration or something. We've been outsourcing our ambition, which I
Yeah.
love that, and I think that gets to the point you're raising about centrality of set your own vision and then go out and try and find investors to get behind it. So this is great.
Yeah. And I mean, I think then you can also borrow prudently, right? So I think Cape Town has three core things that it measures its whether it's going to borrow against. Like it will only borrow if one, it expands the revenue base, or two, it cuts operational costs, or three, it supports economic growth. If it cannot tick those boxes, it will not take the money, right? And obviously fits within their overall vision and strategy. I think the other thing that is really important that Cape Town has done. So Cape Town has been one of the only cities, not only in Africa but globally, to raise a green bond, right, which is a bond that is specifically used to finance projects that are environmentally and sustainably friendly and or work towards mitigation and adaptation goals. Um, it understood that there was a market for this, right? Because there's a lot of investors who now want to green their balance sheet, so to speak. So
Hmm.
it understood there was a market for this. It had a pipeline already. And so it went through its pipeline and not by like now creating a specific new pipeline. No, it used its own existing pipeline and it figured out in that pipeline what were the green elements that it could extract that would then appeal to this source of finance that was there. So it really has been able to use its pipeline and leverage that to match global trends in finance overall, right? But this is all again has been a long-term investment in creating both the vision and the pipeline for the city. And so I think when you think about the Cape Town example, it's easy to sort of for other cities to go like, oh my gosh, Cape Town's so far away, like we can't even, and it has this unique institutional structure. But then it also shows when you dig deep, there are certain things that are important lessons. And this is, how you can start borrowing when you do have, you can start setting your own, expectations towards investors, that become credible because you stick to those principles over time. And as I said, I think another really great example of this, very different institutional structure, obviously, but is the city of Kigali,
Hmm.
and its vision and how it does this, right? And I think when it finally comes down to it, it's also the ability to say no, which I know, again, I say this with the humility that I'm not the person who's sitting making these decisions in a very resource constrained environment. And I think the pressure to say yes to all types of finance is important, but it's important to also note finance is not costless, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
so really being able to make those prudent decisions, and having a framework by which you can, a context, specific framework by which you can make those decisions is very important.
Okay. Okay. So this is great. So that's kind of we went over demand side constraints around African cities to get municipal or mobilize municipal finance, as well as this nice success story, and elements to that success in Cape Town. So let's press on. Let's move on to the some supply side constraints here, that can be getting in the way of the possibility of lending to these cities. So just at least for me, um, this section, this supply constraint section of the report, it was the most like Kafka-esque for me, because this section it's largely based on and you chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's largely based on the African Development Bank's subnational finance guidelines that they published a few years ago in 2019. And you guys right, it turns out most African cities, they do not meet these criteria in these AFDB guidelines, and it's illustrated by the fact that you guys noted, um, the co-authors noted that AFDB hasn't actually delivered a single loan to any African city since issuing these guidelines. I don't know if that's changed, so you can chime in if it has. But um, right, this strikes me as uh, a case where perhaps these guidelines, these regulations around subnational finance may have therefore gotten ahead of the cities they're regulating, right? Um, put it another way, for me, it's kind of like, wouldn't it be more preferable, given, as you noted, there's almost 1 billion new African urbanites being added to cities over a very short period of time? Wouldn't it be preferable that the main issue is spending and borrowing too much, right? Because like that's a lot of people we got to invest in our cities to accommodate, rather than, it seems like, at least the report, it seems like that the bigger threat is spending and borrowing too little in these African cities. Um, so I don't know. To me, the better risk to take is being being overspending and over borrowing. I know it's still a risk, but to me, the guidelines, if there hasn't been a single loan issued in now 6 years, uh, that indicates that there's probably over onerous regulations for the cities at their current capacity levels, and that means the result is underspending and under borrowing. And to me, that's the greater risk than overspending and over. So that was my thoughts of reading this section. I just wanted you to comment on that initial reaction.
Yes. So I have some thoughts on this, and I think these thoughts have developed since I've written this, report. So I think the context is that there is a huge concern about what you say is like subnational governments overspending and over leveraging themselves, right? And that's not an unfounded concern, right? We've had financial crises, particularly, for example, in Latin America, that have been
Yep.
caused by too much subnational borrowing. And the difference between a subnational and a national is that, a subnational will be bailed out by the national, and so, there's a moral hazard risk, right, of
Mm,
someone that you always have like the big brother to bail you out, and so over borrowing, right, and over leveraging yourself. And so I think that's part of it, right? And the African Development Bank, like other regional multilateral development banks, they worry about their own credit rating for which they can go to market, right? And they don't want to ruin that by too many sort of risky loans, right? Because that's what allows them to give concessional finance. So I think there is a sort of reason why they develop guidelines, and these subnational finance guidelines are probably, as you said, like very much the gold standard, right? Which just no African city government can meet. I think the other problem is, and this is a much bigger issue, and one that is actually being considered right now, and by or should be considered, I think, under the South African G20 presidency, is that these banks, both the regional development banks like the African Development Bank, but also the larger banks, right? Like the World Bank can't necessarily directly very easily loan to a city either, right? Is that
Mm,
these banks are developed in really Westphalian institutional structures where it's like
right.
national government to national government lending, right? If you look at even the African Development Bank, right, its shareholders are the national governments, represented essentially by the ministries of finance, right? And so, but if you look at our world is increasingly happening locally, right? So it's really the structure of this multilateral regional entities are very out of step with the sort of development realities and needs on the ground.
Mm,
And so I think that's kind of also plays into, if you read the guidelines, and some of the things that you pick up on, for example, is that a city is constrained by whatever its country's rating is, right? But I know some African cities that probably would definitely probably have a stronger rating. I mean, obviously they can't print their own money, but like, in some ways that is a constraint. It's because we still think of these entities as the sort of the be all and end all, right? Now,
mhm.
I will say, because this is we don't want to go too far, as you said, down the doom and gloom. I will say that I don't expect these structures to change very quickly. Also,
Right.
given where we are globally right now and politically, um, but I do think there's a way that you can overcome this. And we mentioned this briefly in the From Millions to Billions report, but I have done subsequent writing and research around this. And I really think leveraging the role of national development banks, right, which are institutions that are embedded within their economies, and that really understand local challenges, but then can interact at a national, so have that national level entity responsibility and borrow from regional multilateral institutions, but
Mm,
convert that into then actually under reloaning or regranting to cities. I think those as intermediaries, subnational financial intermediaries, are a very potentially powerful way to get financing to cities, and very currently underexploited way of getting financing to cities in the African context, right? And there's multiple other reasons that national development banks can be useful. They can help pool these projects, right? So that
right.
$80,000 you were talking about from one city, it could potentially find another city that needs a similar project, and then you pull it and aggregate it and present it as a packaged project to a financier. Um, and importantly, obviously, it can then on lend in local currency, right? So it means the city, because a lot of these institutions, even the African Development Bank, has some local currency that it can lend in, but definitely not all the currencies in Africa. And a city will not want to borrow in hard currency.
Mm. Yeah, that's a good another good segue. So that was one of the supply constraints mentioned at the beginning of this section on the supply side, uh, is domestic versus foreign currency, borrowing in domestic versus foreign currency. So, if you want to chat a little bit more about the importance of this, because I think this does it sounds technocratic, it gets a little in the weeds, and people's like non-finance nerd people's eyes may start to glaze over, but it's actually incredibly, incredibly important. So
Yeah.
Astrid, tell us why.
Yeah, and make it exciting, right? That's no, I mean, so it essentially comes down to like a city is not a national government, right? A city doesn't have a central bank. A city cannot print money. It cannot hold foreign reserves. And so, it cannot hedge against currency fluctuations, right? So if I'm a city in Africa and I borrow in US dollars, and then um, my own currency depreciates against the US dollar, then it makes repayment of my loan much more expensive, and there's nothing I have in my own power that can hedge against that, right? I guess on top of that, as a city, yes, I'm collecting my property tax, I'm collecting my user fees, I'm collecting, but most of that is going to be in local currency as well,
Mm,
right? So I want to repay whatever I borrow in the same currency, again, to avoid these currency fluctuations. And again, I briefly mentioned the sort of debt crisis, the Latin American debt crisis in the 90s, but that was partially also driven by the fact that a lot of the subnational entities in Latin America
Yeah.
were not only borrowing too much, but they were also borrowing in currencies that were not their own currency. And then when the currency crisis hit, right, they were hit with a double whammy because they both had to repay and then repay more than what they borrowed and had no way to hedge against that. So it's super, super important that cities borrow in local currency. But a major constraint in that sense is that in many of the countries, the local domestic financial markets may not be developed enough to be providing enough of that local currency financing loans, right?
Like
You
the sort of big ones are like local pension funds, local insurance funds. There's no way for those pools of savings to actually be invested or channeled towards investing in city infrastructure.
Exactly. And even where they are, so I've been in roundtables where I've been sitting with pension funds from like, especially my own country, Uganda, where they're like, oh no, we would love to invest in local, city infrastructure, but where's your pipeline? So yeah, even
Yeah.
where they are, they suffer from the same situation, which other international investors suffer from. And particularly things like pension funds are very risk averse in terms of where they want to put their money because they're, playing with people's savings, so to speak. Right.
Right.
So that's, you want that local currency, but sometimes it's difficult to find that local currency. And this is again where a national development bank can be a very important intermediary, because it could, for example, borrow and, it's a national level institution, sometimes directly under the treasury. But, it can borrow in what we call hard currency. So some of the international currencies and unloan that in local currency, but it has a better ability to hedge against that currency risk.
hmm So that was on sort of the importance of having of having access to uh, loans in domestic currency. Um, some other supply constraints that were brought up were around a lack of independently audited accounts at the city level, as well as a lack of credit ratings, right, or credit history. So, do you want to just go into these a bit, and then why they're important for supplying finance to these cities?
Yeah. These are again like analogously to what I was saying about the own source revenue reforms. I think these are type of reforms around independently audited accounts and getting your financial books in order. These are something that cities should be doing themselves and can be doing themselves, right? And I think we need to be doing more of, right? I think this actually is an onus that is on cities. So essentially, if you're an investor, you want to understand that the numbers that the city is presenting to you in terms of its budgets are actually correct. You want to understand what the financial health is of the city, because that's how you assess your risk of whether you're going to be repaid or not. Now, it's one thing for the city to say, "Oh, yes, everything I've written down here is absolutely correct, and, dear Mr. Investor, please believe me." But it's another thing for an independent entity to verify that for you, right? So an independently audited account is exactly what it says it is, right? It's an auditor who comes in, looks and verifies and puts a stamp of approval and says, "Okay, City X has his budget is exactly what it says it is, and its financial accounts, and we've been able to verify all the receipts, etc." That's really powerful, but many, many cities don't have it. Or if they have it, they're not publicly available, right? So if you're an investor, you start worrying like, what is the city trying to hide and why is it not getting an independent audit, right?
Right.
And a credit rating is a similar principle, but it is essentially an overall risk assessment of how that entity, in this case the city, is relatively likely to repay you vis-a-vis other entities that are of similar standing. So like other cities, well, it depends whether it's a local rating or an international rating. But the idea is that it's an independent way for investors to assess whether a city is ability to repay its debt to manage its financial risk. Now, there's a whole debate going on right now about the veracity of credit ratings, particularly vis-a-vis the African continent,
Right.
etc. But I think the whole point about having an independent entity and some transparency in your accounts and therefore your financial books in order is really important if you want to get money. And it's the same if you're like going to a bank, right? Like as a personal,
Yeah.
the personal loan, the bank will want to know that you're going to repay the loan and ask for, various verified documents to know who you are, and then your ability to repay as well, right? So this is the same thing on a public level.
Yeah. Um, this question just struck me as you were speaking, and it also occurred as I was reading the report. But all of it, especially for your case studies, all of the stuff that you guys researched and uncovered was publicly available, right? So basically, you guys had to kind of Google around and find it. It's hard to
Not
do, right? I've tried to do this. How like just this is more for just you. How difficult was it for you guys to find and pinpoint, like how resource and time intensive was it to go about finding all this information at these 10 cities that you have in your case studies?
I would say it took the majority of the report was actually doing those case studies and finding that data. And here we want to highlight good practice. Massive, massive shout out to the Kenyan government. So the Kenyan government is probably the most systematically and transparently available data on every county every year. Really kudos to the Kenyan government. I must say, those were some of the easiest accounts to find, to interpret, to understand.
Yeah.
Uh, but for all others, we only worked through publicly available data. We had to piece together lots of piece of data. We had to go to audit reports. We had to go to national treasuries, sometimes cities. Like it was very, very difficult, and it took us a lot of time to do. There's no way an investor who's going to come and try and
Right.
invest is going to take the time that we did. So really this is a shout out to cities themselves that this has to be improved if you're looking to ask other people to put money into your cities, right? This should be
Yeah.
something relatable.
And it's really funny that it's Kenya that's the standout, because under the new constitution, under devolution, right, it's the counties that have basically control of the cities. They appoint all the urban boards and stuff. So I would imagine, I'm sure you and I, like, we would prefer these cities to have some of their own controls and be empowered to raise their own source revenue and stuff. But there might be some benefits if capacity is low at the local level to have some of these this data and this monitoring stuff done at a coordinated, perhaps aggregated way. In this case, at the county or regional level. Um,
So actually in
that was just a
Kenya, it's the counties reporting to the national level. So it's actually a national level entity who does all of this aggregation, and the counties report to the national level entity to do it. So it is even more centralized than that, but it means it's also comparable across counties, which is really important. And I will also say
right.
the other shout out is obviously South Africa. South Africa has incredible municipal data, but because it's always easy to pick out South Africa, and as I said, it has various distinct institutional structures that are not always replicable. It's also interesting to look at other examples. In this case, Kenya is a very good one. But I think it's partially the reporting requirements that have been implemented now in Kenya and that are very much followed up on, that make this data become more available. Also recently, again, since this report was published, 10 counties have undergone shadow credit ratings in
Mm,
Kenya. So that is also publicly available information on the shadow credit ratings for the 10 counties. So there is actually quite good information. Unfortunately, for what it then shows, it shows where you have to improve. But I think the first step of reform is actually understanding what you need to reform. And for most of the
right.
cities, it isn't clear yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. That and then this is good because you just kind of talked about some changes or evolutions that have happened since the publication of the report, and that's where I kind of wanted to end it here. So you and your co-authors, you wrote this great report. This was a couple years ago now, right, Astrid?
I think it was published 2023. Yeah, so maybe a
2023, so
year.
a couple years ago. So you guys wrote a couple years ago. This came out. It has several very, I think, concrete policy recommendations beyond the ones you've mentioned. So there's been a few credit ratings done in Kenyan counties. I think you mentioned earlier the Nigerian states are setting up some independent fiscal or financial commissions that make national transfers a little more predictable and stuff. Any other um, municipalities, regional governments, central governments across Africa that have taken up some of these recommendations and implemented them?
So, I mean, I'm not always aware of what happens as a result, but I must say this was one of the things I write a lot. I enjoy writing, so I don't expect everything to be read. This seems to be one of the reports that has actually been read and been more publicly consumed, so to speak. So I was also made aware that last week or a couple weeks ago, at the Urban Shift conference, there was a letter that was signed by some of the C40 mayors that also called upon, um, national governments to do their bit, in terms of also thinking. I think about the transfers. I haven't seen the letter, so I cannot confirm any of this. Right? But that was also, there was questions around that came to me around that. So it seems that pieces have been picked up in other advocacy campaigns. I know a piece of work that I followed up on since this report, that should hopefully be coming out soon as well, is the question on credit ratings, and municipal credit ratings, and when not to get a credit rating, and why and why not to get a credit rating. Because the credit rating, again, it's not costless, right? It
Mm,
does cost money. And so I've delved a lot more as a result of this report. I've delved a lot deeper into the credit rating question. I think it's really important right now because there's a global conversation going on around credit ratings. And then I think the other piece is the understanding around the fact that things like the subnational finance guidelines are not yet currently delivering. So, what it is going to
yeah.
deliver, I think that's the national development banks. And I'm really hopeful with the G20 presidency and the DBSA being, I mean, I know the DBSA is now a kind of more of a regional development bank, but it started as a national development bank, right?
Mhm.
With them taking a really forefront role and being a really good example of how these banks can get money to cities,
Right.
that have a much more prominent agenda over the coming year, both as part of the G20 presidency, but then also as part of the debate. And I know the Finance in Common Summit happened last week in Cape Town, where that's, all the sort of public development banks come together. And I know the DBSA had a leading role in convening that. So, I think there is the I don't think in this current political turmoil we always say the time is right, but I do think when it comes to urban financing, I think the pieces are coming together for us to figure out how we can start improving the situation, and we do see very positive steps towards that. You know, hopefully sometimes bigger. Like we do want bigger steps, but we do we see the steps being made.
Yeah, that's great. And then just last question here. I always like to know what are you working on now, and why do you think it's important?
What am I working
Other
on
than
now?
obviously your course you're going to teach at the Africa Urban Lab, what are you working on now, and why do you think it's
Yes,
important?
and I look forward to teaching that in April this year. No, I'm working on two things. So I'm still, as I said, based in Hong Kong, and I think there's a lot more that I want to unpack about the Chinese urbanization story. But also, what I'm trying to now get at more at is also understanding Chinese investments in Africa, but from the Chinese perspective. What is driving the urban piece there. I continue to do a lot of work around land value capture, and land based financing because I think that has a lot of potential for African cities. And then obviously my personal research agenda that I'm very passionate about. I am a feminist urban economist. I really want to understand how you make public infrastructure and service investments that actually benefit the majority rather than the minority in cities,
Mm,
right? And so that's really something from a research perspective. I'm looking at the combination of the sort of infrastructure and the gender agendas, and bringing those together. That I'm still very much at the outset of that, but very much that drives my thinking in it as well. My sort of advice to governments is really how this is we don't raise money and spend money in a sort of a vacuum. In fact,
right.
ultimately affects people. And so how we can make sure it affects people in a positive way, how we make sure, at very least we do no harm, is something that drives my own personal passion. So I'm actually sort of now digging into this deeper, from a research perspective.
That's great. Astrid Haas, thank you so much for the conversation today. And as I said, we're looking forward to seeing you here in Zanzibar for the Urban Labs diploma next month.
Thank you so much, Curtis. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Africa Urban Lab podcast. To listen to our other episodes, follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. And pretty please, if you liked the episode, share it with your friends and your network. It really, really helps grow the show. We appreciate it, and we appreciate you. Thanks so much.